It will no longer be possible for me to give so much of my time and energies in the middle of Buckingham Palace." Quiet whispers suddenly turned into loud gasps when Queen Camilla unexpectedly collapsed just moments after Prince William shared some shocking news that nobody saw coming. This wasn't just some regular announcement. It was King Charles's last and final wish. He said it in front of witnesses, and it had been kept secret until right now. Palace workers rushed over, cameras started flashing, and just like that, hundreds of years of royal rules were completely broken, right in front of everyone watching. Before we dive deeper into what this actually means for the royal family, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you won't miss any updates. The big announcement hit like a bolt of lightning in the blue drawing room. This was meant to be a controlled private meeting, a calm moment with just the senior royals and palace officials. But what actually happened was far from normal. Camilla, who had dealt with decades of public criticism, suddenly found herself in a weak position, losing her cool as William's voice rang out through the hall. There was no fancy ceremony, no speech that had been written ahead of time, just the raw and direct delivery of a message that carried the complete weight of a king's final instructions. The silence that came after was almost too much to bear. Everyone in that room knew they had just seen the start of a huge change in royal history. Helpers rushed over to Camilla's side, but them being there only showed how serious what had just happened really was. She wasn't reacting to just feeling faint or a small surprise. This was the exact moment when her position, her legacy, and her decades of carefully built influence started to fall apart. William, though clearly affected by what was happening, stayed strong. His face wasn't celebrating, and it wasn't showing regret either. It was the face of a guy who had a heavy responsibility on his shoulders, knowing that his words had just set off a truth that had been hidden behind palace walls for a long time. Senior family members looked at each other with worried expressions, not sure whether they should comfort Camilla or get ready for the consequences that were now impossible to avoid. Out in the hallways, rumors were already starting to spread. Even without cameras inside the room, the royal machine couldn't keep something this big contained. Staff members whispered to reporters. Wild guessing flooded the news networks, and within minutes, social media turned Buckingham Palace into the center of worldwide drama. Headlines started describing the event as a palace crisis, suggesting betrayal, secret wills, and cracks forming within the royal household. To people watching from outside, it seemed like an explosive secret had ripped through the monarchy. Inside, it felt way more personal. For William, this wasn't just some ceremonial responsibility. It was an action shaped by weeks of emotional struggle and private conversations with his father. The king's final wish wasn't a gentle suggestion. It was a purposeful, firm move that would challenge the actual hierarchy of the royal family. Camilla's collapse was more than just a physical reaction. It was the symbolic moment when the mask cracked, revealing everything that had been building up underneath the surface. But to really understand why Camilla's world came crashing down, we need to go back to the weeks before this moment. A time period filled with whispered meetings, hidden letters, and a king's final confession that nobody expected. Behind closed palace doors, while the world paid attention to ceremonial appearances, King Charles's health was getting worse really fast. He pulled back from public life, spending long, quiet hours in his private home, surrounded by only a few people he trusted. But it wasn't just sickness that was bothering him. It was a secret he had been carrying around for decades, one that he now felt he needed to reveal before it was too late. At first, the changes were hard to notice. Public events that had been carefully planned months ahead of time started to quietly disappear from the royal schedule. The official explanations talked about small adjustments and routine considerations. But inside palace walls, whispers carried a different feeling, one of increasing worry. Charles, who had once been determined to be a clearly active monarch, started leaving events earlier, cutting appearances short, and saying no to invitations he had previously accepted. In the strict world of royal rules, even the tiniest change means something, and this sudden pulling back set off quiet alarm bells throughout the institution. Senior palace workers trained to notice shifts in royal patterns sensed that something was happening behind the fancy doors that very few people were being allowed to see. As the weeks went by, a new nightly routine appeared. The windows of Charles's private study glowed well into the early morning hours, night after night. People who walked through the hallways described a king who was increasingly obsessed with something nobody could see. He spent long periods of time alone, looking back through old papers, letters, and diary entries he hadn't looked at in years. These weren't just idle moments of remembering the past. They were purposeful, intense, and weighed down with importance. Trusted staff members started to notice the king's expression changing as he read through the past, sometimes looking deeply thoughtful, other times almost tortured. It was like each letter brought him closer to an unavoidable truth he had put off facing for way too long. And then came the private meetings with William. No public announcements, no official court entries, no helpers present, only father and son behind closed doors. Their conversations so private that even experienced palace staff could only guess what was being said. Each meeting ended with William leaving in silence, his face carrying the weight of something heavy. Advisors exchanged worried looks, but didn't dare ask questions. It was obvious that these weren't just casual conversations. They were shaping the future of the monarchy itself. Camilla, in the meantime, started to sense the growing distance. For years, she had stood by Charles's side, completely integrated into the working heart of the royal household. But suddenly, she found doors closed, meetings held without her, and explanations that felt rehearsed. The subtle change in Charles's behavior, his avoiding answers, his increasing time alone, fed her unease. She wasn't just being kept out of political planning, she was being left out of something way more personal, something that struck at the core of her place in his world. Her questions were answered with unclear reassurances, but the avoiding only made her more suspicious. She felt a truth forming in the shadows, one that she couldn't name or control. During these hidden days, Charles's world got smaller to just its most important parts: his conscience, his heir, and the legacy he wanted to leave behind. Palace workers whispered about a huge decision being made, though nobody could predict how big it would be. But one thing became obvious. This wasn't about public image or ceremonial titles. It was about the actual spirit of the crown and who would carry it forward when he couldn't anymore. Every night of restless thinking brought him closer to the moment when secrecy would give way to revelation. And then, on a quiet, late autumn night, the king called for his oldest son, setting into motion a series of events that would lead to Camilla's public collapse. It was just after midnight when Prince William got a discreet summons to his father's private rooms. No helpers, no advisors, no cameras, just a father and son facing the weight of the monarchy. What Charles revealed in that private candlelit room would change William's role forever, and the words spoken that night would become the foundation of the most explosive revelation in modern royal history. The atmosphere inside Charles's private quarters was unlike anything William had experienced before. It was quiet, heavy, almost unnaturally still. Gone were the formalities that usually framed their conversations. There were no secretaries taking notes, no senior palace workers hovering nearby. It was a rare moment of unguarded reality between a monarch and his heir. Charles, often composed and careful with his words, appeared deeply unsettled. His eyes carried the weight of both urgency and vulnerability, as if time itself was slipping away faster than he could hold on to it. William instantly sensed that this wasn't a routine discussion about royal events or ceremonial duties. Something way more important was happening. Charles started slowly, his words careful, his voice low. He admitted a fear that had haunted him for years. The fear that after his death, his real intentions would be twisted, watered down, or buried beneath layers of palace politics. He talked about how history had a way of silencing inconvenient truths, how carefully constructed stories often suffocated the personal wishes of monarchs. He didn't want that fate. Not for his legacy, not for the crown. There was something he needed to say, something he needed William to carry. With shaking hands, Charles reached into his desk and pulled out a single envelope sealed with the royal symbol. It wasn't the size of an official document, and it didn't have the markings of state business. This was intensely personal. He called it his final wish. The letter contained instructions that were never supposed to be read publicly until the time was right, and William alone would decide when that moment would come. He told his son that the letter carried not just his words, but the core of his vision for the monarchy's future. It was his last protection against being misunderstood. William's reaction was immediate and torn. A mix of loyalty, fear, and disbelief washed over him. He had prepared for many royal responsibilities, but nothing like this. The seriousness of what his father was trusting him with pressed down like a crown made of iron. He understood that accepting this letter meant stepping into a role that went beyond just duty. It meant becoming the only guardian of a legacy that could either strengthen or break the monarchy. His heart raced as he held the envelope. Realizing he was holding a truth capable of reshaping hundreds of years of tradition, Charles spoke. With unusual bluntness about what was in the letter, he didn't reveal every single line, but he made it clear that it signaled a dramatic shift in royal titles and succession symbolism. It wasn't just ceremonial, it would affect the hierarchy within the family itself. He warned William that what was written inside would not be welcomed by everyone. "Not everyone will accept this," he said seriously, "and Camilla, especially Camilla, will fight against it with everything she has." His voice carried both determination and sadness. He knew the storm that would follow, but he had chosen clarity over comfort. William left his father's rooms that night, carrying more than just a sealed letter. He carried the weight of a decision that would one day set the palace on fire with tension and revelation. From that night forward, William carried a secret that burned like fire, one that would divide loyalties, test family bonds, and ultimately bring Camilla to her knees. While the king and his heir were locked in quiet discussions, Camilla started to sense something was terribly wrong. Her instincts, sharpened by years of palace drama, told her she was being left out. Behind the smiles at royal events, her eyes looked for clues, her heart gripped by a growing fear. Charles was hiding something, and William had become his trusted confidant. It started with small, easily missed changes. William's visits to his father became more frequent and noticeably private. Meetings that once included senior household figures, where Camilla often played a commanding role, were now happening behind closed doors, unrecorded and unannounced. She would see William arriving without the usual group of people, slipping through hallways that bypassed her section of the residence. Conversations between father and son went late into the night, sometimes lasting hours. And yet, when she asked what had been discussed, she got vague reassurances, carefully worded phrases that told her everything and nothing all at once. For a woman who had spent decades learning how to read between the lines of palace life, the shift was obvious. She had built her position not through blood, but through planning, influence, and a careful understanding of how power ebbs and flows within royal walls. Now she was finding herself purposely kept at the edges. Strategic briefings, she once dominated, were suddenly rescheduled without her input. Invitations to key discussions never showed up. When she questioned her allies in the household, the responses were avoiding, their tone polite but distant. "Nothing to worry about, ma'am. The king is just tired. There's nothing unusual to report." Each reply only made her more suspicious. Paranoia started to take root. Camilla had survived decades of public hate and institutional resistance by staying one step ahead. But this time, she sensed a conversation happening just out of her reach. A conversation about her future. She turned to her closest trusted friends, the few people she truly trusted, but even they seemed unsure. William's sudden closeness to Charles was unprecedented. It wasn't the ordinary bond of a king and his heir. It was something deeper, something sealed in confidence. Camilla understood enough about royal dynamics to know that, when secrets are formed between a monarch and the successor, they are rarely harmless. The tensions seeped into her marriage. Dinner, once a private, safe place between her and Charles, became filled with silence. She would search his face for signs, gently try to get explanations. But his responses became more cautious, almost rehearsed. She recognized the subtle deflections, the way he changed the subject just before revealing too much. For a woman who had been his closest companion and advisor, this sudden distance cut deep. It wasn't just political exclusion, it was personal. A quiet crack was forming between them, one that neither seemed willing to talk about. Camilla's instincts told her she had to do something. She started preparing for the possibility that something significant was happening without her knowledge. Discreet phone calls were made. Plans were drafted in the shadows of her private quarters. She told herself she was protecting her position, but in truth, she was bracing for a revelation she could feel coming. Every whisper in the hallways, every sideways glance between William and Charles fed the growing sense of inevitability. But Charles had already made his choice, and his words would soon echo through the palace with devastating accuracy. Hidden inside the king's desk was a letter unlike any royal decree before it. Handwritten, sealed with the royal symbol, entrusted only to Prince William. This letter carried the king's final wish, a wish that would redefine the legacy of the monarchy, shake Camilla's position, and realign the crown's future with a single irreversible statement. It wasn't a formal document drafted by advisors or polished by legal experts. This was personal. Charles had chosen his words purposefully with the clarity and weight of a man who knew he was writing his final chapter. The seal itself, pressed deep into wax, bearing the royal symbol, signaled that this was not a letter to be opened lightly. It was a confession, a directive, and a legacy all wrapped into one carefully folded piece of paper. For William, holding it in his hands was like holding the future of the crown itself. The pure seriousness of what was inside pressed down on him, stirring both respect and worry. The opening lines immediately went against hundreds of years of royal tradition. Charles skipped the formal language of constitutional declarations and state protocols. There were no cold legal phrases, no careful hedging typical of royal communications. Instead, the tone was intimate, almost fatherly, but beneath it ran a current of unshakable determination. He made it clear that this letter did not go through palace workers or government officials for approval. It was his voice alone, unfiltered, unchallenged, and final. He wrote not as a distant monarch, but as a man determined to make sure his true intentions survived beyond the machinery of the institution. What came next left William breathless. Charles spoke openly of his deep and lasting admiration for Diana's legacy. He wrote about how her spirit, her compassion, and the public's unwavering love for her shaped the modern image of the monarchy. He admitted that no future could be built by ignoring that legacy. Instead, it had to be woven into the actual fabric of what the crown would become. His words were gentle and uncompromising. He made it clear that the lineage and moral authority of the monarchy must continue through William and his family, reflecting the values the late princess represented. Then came the heart of the letter, the part that would turn royal expectations upside down. Camilla's future title and ceremonial role were to be drastically reduced. Charles stripped back positions she had long assumed would be hers, reshaping her standing in ways that no one, not even she, could have imagined. William paused over those sentences, stunned by how direct they were. This was not the cautious language of someone trying to avoid conflict. This was a monarch making a purposeful, irreversible decision that would ripple through every branch of the royal household. But the king did not stop there. He elevated Catherine to a symbolic successor role that placed her above Camilla in importance, a gesture filled with meaning. It wasn't just about titles. It was about trust, legacy, and the face of the monarchy's future. Catherine was to represent the institution's moral authority and modern identity. Standing as a bridge between the late Diana's vision and the crown's continuing story, in doing so, Charles redrew the royal hierarchy with quiet but undeniable force. William sat in silence as he took in the letter's contents. He understood instantly that this was more than a father's private message. It was a political earthquake disguised as ink on paper. The public reaction, the institutional consequences, the personal fallout, it all came together in his mind at once. The letter was clear, but its consequences were anything but simple. It demanded courage, timing, and the willingness to start a firestorm that would shake the palace to its foundations. The stage was set. All that remained was the right moment for William to reveal the king's words, a moment that would arrive far sooner than anyone expected. As the king's health got worse, Buckingham Palace arranged a private but mandatory gathering of senior royals and key advisors. Officially, it was to discuss ceremonial transitions. Unofficially, William had brought the letter. Camilla entered the room, poised, unaware that in minutes, her royal world would crumble. The air was heavy with secrets, and even experienced palace workers sensed history was about to change. The monarchy's inner circle assembled behind closed doors. This was not a public show or a routine briefing. These were the people who operated in the shadows of power, the senior royals, the trusted advisors, the decision-makers, who understood that moments like this shaped dynasties. At the center of it all was William. He appeared calm, but beneath that controlled exterior was the knowledge that what he carried had the power to fracture or redefine the royal family forever. The letter, sealed and unassuming, rested within his grasp like a loaded weapon. Camilla, as was her habit, took a position of influence from the start. For years, she had skillfully worked her way to the heart of royal decision-making, often guiding conversations and asserting her role as a central figure beside the king. Her tone was confident, her presence commanding. She believed this was yet another strategic meeting about ceremonial logistics because of Charles's declining health. A moment to reinforce her standing and remind everyone of her position. What she didn't realize was that the ground beneath her was about to give way. William watched her closely, not with hostility, but with the quiet determination of someone carrying a truth that would soon overshadow every word spoken in that room. Advisors, used to the usual rhythm of these meetings, started exchanging uneasy glances. They sensed that something was different. The usual discussion flow was awkward. William's silence, normally respectful but unremarkable, carried weight this time. It wasn't the silence of being passive, it was the silence before revelation. As the discussions moved through formalities, William's hand moved purposefully. He reached for the letter. The moment he placed it on the table, the energy in the room shifted. Advisors straightened in their seats. Camilla's confident expression faltered ever so slightly, confusion flickering behind her composed exterior. The letter was unmistakable. Its seal, the king's personal symbol, and the seriousness it carried were known to everyone present. No one spoke, but in that shared pause, hundreds of years of tradition seemed to hover in the air, waiting to be either preserved or shattered. William cleared his throat, his voice steady yet loaded with emotion. He explained that the letter contained his father's personal and final directive, words that skipped bureaucratic layers, unfiltered and absolute. He did not embellish, nor did he soften its importance. His composure hid the emotional storm beneath. He knew that once he opened that letter and shared its contents, there would be no turning back. The palace's balance of power, carefully maintained through appearances and unspoken understandings, was about to be rewritten in ink and spoken out loud. Camilla tried to regain control, interrupting with her usual poise, steering the conversation toward familiar ground, but this time her attempts were met with silence. Advisors who would normally defer to her influence hesitated, their loyalty torn between established power and the authority of the king's final words. William's presence at the head of the table, the letter before him, and the tension that filled the room all signaled that this was no longer her arena to control. In the years to come, they would call it the Night of the Wish, not because of the letter's existence, but because of the way everything shifted in that single moment. Power, legacy, identity, everything hung in the balance. And then, with hundreds of years of tradition behind him and his father's words before him, William began to read. With every eye fixed on him, Prince William slowly unsealed the letter. The sound of cracking wax echoed through the room like a verdict. As he read King Charles's handwritten words out loud, a royal bombshell went off. Camilla's face lost all its color as she heard line by line a vision of the monarchy that no longer placed her at its heart. The king's final wish was now public and irreversible. The room seemed to close in around William as he began to speak. Each word carried not just the authority of a king, but the raw, unfiltered truth of a father determined to shape the future on his own terms. He read slowly, carefully, making sure that every syllable landed with the full force of its meaning. The letter began with an acknowledgement of the immense weight of the crown and the generations that had come before. But very quickly, Charles's words turned personal. He spoke of legacy not just as an idea, but as a living thread that connected his reign to the next. Binding past to future through bloodline and intention, Charles's language left no room for confusion. He declared in clear and unwavering terms that the future of the monarchy must rest with William and Catherine. He emphasized their role not as distant heirs, but as the beating heart of a modern crown, symbols of continuity, stability, and renewal. He spoke of the monarchy's need to reflect the moral compass of the people, bringing up the legacy of Diana with deep emotion. Her name wasn't simply mentioned. It was woven into the actual reasoning of his decision. Her influence, he wrote, could not be erased, and her spirit would find its rightful continuation through William's family. As the words flowed, the tone shifted. Charles addressed matters of titles and roles, issues that might seem ceremonial to outsiders, but within palace walls determined power, importance, and influence. With a calm yet uncompromising hand, he stripped back Camilla's ceremonial titles and future roles. It was not wrapped in apology or hesitation. He stated plainly that the evolving nature of the monarchy required clarity and that this decision was final. Camilla's expected place within the royal hierarchy was reduced in his own handwriting. Her role, once seen as secure, was quietly yet decisively undone. Gasps and exchanged glances rippled through the advisors. Shock ran through the room like an electric current. Hundreds of years of proper behavior dictated silence. But whispers began to rise at the edges. As if no one could fully contain how enormous what they had just heard was, Camilla's hands shook beneath the table. The words she had feared, those that would cast her to the edges of the crown's future, were not whispered rumors or hostile leaks. They were Charles's own, spoken by the son who now carried the burden of revealing them. William continued reading, his voice steady, even as his heart grew heavier with each line. This was his father's vision, but it was also his responsibility to uphold it. And in the final paragraphs, Charles left no doubt. He reaffirmed his trust in William's judgment, instructing him to guard this vision fiercely, even against resistance from within the family. When William finished, his eyes were glistening. He folded the letter carefully, his hands showing the emotional weight he carried. He stood before the family and advisors, not as just a messenger, but as the executor of his father's legacy. He had delivered the words exactly as written, without embellishment, without hesitation. But as his gaze swept the room and landed on Camilla, he saw the devastation those words had caused. It wasn't scandal, rumor, or speculation that had stripped her of power. It was the king's own hand, purposeful and final. And in that instant, Camilla's world shattered, not through scandal or rumor, but through the king's own hand. She stood frozen for a heartbeat, then staggered backward. Camilla collapsed before the stunned royal circle, her crown slipping slightly as helpers rushed to her side. It wasn't just physical shock, it was the public dismantling of everything she had built. The cameras waiting outside would soon capture a queen, leaving the palace not in triumph but in tears. For a brief suspended moment, no one moved. The silence that followed the reading of the king's letter was shattered by the sound of gasps and hurried footsteps. Camilla's body gave way under the pure weight of what she had heard, as if the foundation she had stood on for years had crumbled in an instant. Advisors lunged forward to support her, their faces pale with disbelief. What had just been revealed was not just symbolic, it was a direct, irreversible statement from the king that stripped her influence in full view of those who mattered most. William stood motionless, watching the chaos unfold with a storm of emotions flashing behind his composed exterior. He hadn't expected this. The letter had been powerful, but the human reaction in front of him was far more intense than anything he had prepared for. A fleeting expression of guilt crossed his face, quickly replaced by the steel of duty. He understood the seriousness of the moment. He was both the bearer of truth and indirectly the trigger for her unraveling. The advisors turned to him, some silently questioning whether the proceedings should be paused, whether mercy should take priority over tradition. But William didn't waver. His father's final wish was not something to be negotiated. Camilla, once the commanding presence in any royal gathering, was now visibly broken. Her face showed the look of someone who had just witnessed the collapse of a carefully constructed world. For decades, she had fought against public criticism, against institutional resistance, against the weight of history itself. And in a moment, the king's own hand made those battles meaningless. She tried to compose herself, but the words still echoed in her mind, words that shifted her from the center of royal power to its edges. The woman who had once stood, shoulder to shoulder with the monarch, was now being gently escorted out of the room she had thought she controlled. Outside the palace walls, the news broke almost instantly. The media, always watching, caught wind of the emergency happening behind closed doors. Sirens, rushed movements, and whispers from palace staff created the perfect storm of wild guessing. Global headlines began to appear within minutes, each more dramatic than the last. Queen collapses amid palace shock. William reads king's final words, Camilla in tears. What had been an intimate royal confrontation was now transforming into a worldwide show. Inside, the royal family and senior advisors were left divided. Some were struck by sympathy, moved by the sudden collapse of a woman who had endured so much to be where she was. Others, however, quietly rallied behind Charles's vision, believing that the king's decision was not cruelty, but clarity, a decisive act to secure the crown's future. The palace atmosphere shifted from tension to a cold, focused silence. No one could deny that the monarchy had crossed a point of no return. William remained at the center, holding the king's letter in his hands like a sacred decree. He knew there would be fallout, but he also knew retreat was impossible. What had been set in motion could not be undone. Camilla's collapse was not just a personal moment of weakness. It was the living representation of a dynasty, turning away from her decisively and publicly. But even as Camilla was carried out, the monarchy could not pause. The king's final wish demanded to be honored. The revelation of King Charles's final wish sent shockwaves across the nation and the world. But behind the chaos, a new royal era was taking shape, one that placed William and Catherine at its heart, restoring the legacy of Diana and realigning the monarchy's moral center. Camilla's collapse was not the end. It was the beginning of a deep transformation. In the days that followed, the palace moved quickly, almost with surgical precision. Rules that had once seemed unbreakable began to shift quietly but decisively. Behind closed doors, royal officials worked to put into action the instructions outlined in Charles's letter, setting in motion adjustments that would reshape the inner structure of the monarchy. Titles were realigned, ceremonial responsibilities were redefined, and subtle but unmistakable changes began to appear in the way royal events were organized. What had been spoken overnight was now becoming an institutional reality. William and Catherine emerged as the unmistakable center of this new chapter. Their appearances became more frequent and carried a new sense of seriousness. Every handshake, every speech, every public event was loaded with symbolic meaning. The world watched as they stepped not just into roles of future leadership, but into the living representation of Charles's vision. Catherine, in particular, became a figure of renewed respect. Her presence echoed Diana's lasting influence. And in this realignment, the monarchy found a story that connected with the public's emotional memory, a bridge between the past and the future. The media grabbed hold of the moment with unrelenting intensity. Headlines framed the shift as a moral course correction, portraying the king's final wish as a bold attempt to reconcile the monarchy with its people. Commentators spoke of legacy, healing, and strategic foresight. International coverage amplified the story, turning what had begun as a private revelation into a global turning point. Across television panels and newspaper editorials, one theme dominated: the monarchy was changing, and William and Catherine were now its undeniable center. Meanwhile, Camilla pulled back from public life. Officially, it was for health and recovery. Unofficially, it was a sign of a broken household, adjusting to a new power dynamic. Her absence was felt, but the institution moved on with striking momentum, as if the crown itself had decided that there was no space for hesitation. The silence around her only emphasized the scale of what had happened. She had gone from a figure of influence to a symbol of a past the monarchy was no longer willing to center. Charles's letter, now treated as a document of constitutional significance, was placed in the royal collection. Future historians would one day look at it as a crucial artifact, an intimate message that triggered a public transformation. Its presence in the archives signaled not just the end of a reign, but the purposeful crafting of a legacy that would extend beyond the king's lifetime. The British public's reaction was intense and deeply emotional. For some, it was a moment of relief, a long-awaited acknowledgement of Diana's lasting influence, and a shift toward a monarchy they could once again believe in. For others, it was a shocking demonstration of how quickly royal power could be redefined by the stroke of a pen. Crowds gathered outside palaces, not in protest, but in thought about the huge shift that had just taken place. As the palace gates closed that night, one era ended and another began, not through scandal, but through a father's final decisive wish. Thanks for watching.